Welcome to Hopkins at Home. My name is Dan Markey, and I'm a senior research professor in international relations and the director of the Master of Arts in Global Policy at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. For those of you who don't know, the Master of Arts in Global Policy is a 16-month degree program for experienced professionals who work while they earn the degree. I'm also happy to say that I'm a proud graduate of the Johns Hopkins School of Arts and Sciences. And today I'm here to talk about China's Western horizon. Now this, as you can see from the slide, which should show the cover of the book, is the title of my new book. And by Western horizon, what I mean is the sweep of territory that extends from China's western frontier all the way up, more or less, to the doorstep of Europe. I have a lot to say about the book itself, but I'm also really pleased to announce that Hopkins at Home will be using the book as a framework for a virtual book club. And so for interested readers, there'll be 4 Zoom-based discussion sections that will take place over the coming months. And I'll be working together with a SAIS PhD student, Ms. Hasta Coleman, to pull all of this together. And each of those 4 sessions will focus on a different aspect of the book. And if you're interested in this, you can check out the link, which should be on your screen now below the video. In addition to these discussion sessions, which will take place on Zoom, you'll have access to other types of online content, including recommended readings, videos, maps, and other interactive features. So this is a new experiment. I'm excited to be a part of it, and I hope that many of you will join us. Now, back to today's lecture. So I'm going to be focusing on 4 main topics. The first of these is the rise in tensions between the United States and China. The second is the potential significance of Eurasia, this territory that I'm describing, in that geopolitical competition between Washington and Beijing. And among the questions that I'll ask in that second section are, what exactly is China up to in Eurasia? How are Eurasians themselves responding to what China is doing? And how does that interaction all add up? The third section of today's talk will focus on US policy options. How might the United States respond to what's going on in Eurasia? And then finally, I'll offer some of my own recommendations that I would give to US policymakers for how to manage this complicated set of issues. I'm going to go for about 40 minutes and then try to leave some time for your questions. So please do start thinking as I'm talking about various questions you may have for me. You'll be able to type those in on your webpage, and then they'll pop up in my chat screen. Okay, so first section of this lecture is this rise in US-China tensions. Now, for many observers, the current situation is being described as a new type of Cold War between Washington and Beijing, between the United States and China. And if you've been reading the newspaper, as I hope you do, you'll see that at least some members of the Trump administration are seeing things in exactly these terms. So Secretary of State Pompeo gave a pretty tough speech just last week at the Nixon Library. And the New York Times has now published a series of stories about how the administration is actually pushing the relationship with China toward some sort of a rupture, taking actions like the closure of China's consulate in Houston and law enforcement steps against accused Chinese spies who are, at least according to the US government, have been involved in industrial espionage. And while there are those who are criticizing the Trump administration, so take a look at the Washington Post today, you'll see Richard Haass, who does exactly that. Many of the statements from the Biden campaign look pretty hawkish on China as well. And so I think there are a lot of reasons that we should anticipate that actually the Democrats and the Republicans are going to compete as to who can be tougher on China as the election season unfolds. So that's the US side, but this is not a one-sided competition. The Chinese, and many of the Chinese also see tensions rising, see the relationship with the United States as China's main geopolitical competition. And at the same time as they have great ambitions for China's rise in the world, even to the point of displacing the United States from its preeminent position in Asia, or even to contest global leadership with the United States. Many of them also criticize the United States for what they believe to be pursuing a policy of containment against China, to limit China's rise. Now, this debate over the nature of the US-China relationship is hardly new, but it has turned a corner in recent years toward a recognition that these tensions have turned beyond a kind of a polite competition and a move toward engagement by both sides, but something that looks more conflict-prone. And I think it's worth recognizing that this is not just a competition because of leaders like President Trump or China's leader, Xi Jinping. This is something that cuts more deeply than that. There are what you might call deeper structural forces at work. The rise of what the United States, many analysts have described as a peer competitor in China, a major, great power, is something we've been anticipating now for decades. And as many of you probably know, there is at least one school of thought in thinking about international relations that if you have a rising peer competitor that challenges the status quo, that challenges, in this case, the United States, you'll tend to see the two sides butt heads. Now, this doesn't make a war between China and the United States inevitable, but it does mean that navigating this power transition is going to be tricky. And it raises all kinds of questions about what sort of new Cold War we're actually facing. And among other things, I think it's important to recognize that even though there are parallels, important parallels between what we see now and what we've seen in the past, history never really repeats itself. It can, as they say, it can rhyme, but it doesn't repeat. And there are important differences between what we're seeing now in the US-China competition and I think what we saw during the Cold War period with the Soviet Union. And the principal difference, I would say, is that the United States and China are economically intertwined in ways that the United States and the Soviet Union never were. So we begin this competition with China deeply entangled in each other's economies, and also more enmeshed in a globalized economy, and therefore mutually vulnerable to the disruption of that global economy. Again, in ways that certainly the Soviet Union with a closed economy and the United States with its block of partners in the capitalist world really weren't seeing quite that kind of entanglement. And so even if we do undertake a degree of what is now being described as decoupling, that is sort of breaking the world into various pieces, keeping certain sectors of the US economy and other economies closed to China's involvement, even if we see that, this mutual economic vulnerability runs quite deep between the two sides. And that, in turn, should, by many accounts, make both sides more risk averse. But even if it doesn't, it makes the complexity of this competition between the United States and China much, much deeper. It is like the Iron Curtain has descended, Cold War style, in certain ways, but quite unlike it in others. And I think just generally more complicated. But that takes me to the second section of today's lecture. And here I'd like to discuss the political significance of Eurasia. And here I've got a map up. And so one of the things that I would start by saying is that one of the interesting similarities now between this current competition with China and the US-Soviet Cold War competition is that the United States is again facing a challenger which is located on this swath of this sort of mega continent of Eurasia. It's facing a geopolitical challenge from a Eurasian state. But of course, if you think about it, at least many Americans, if you sit down to think about it, China has typically been seen more as an Asian state, or even an East Asian or Pacific power, not a Eurasian state. And that's something that we need to think about more carefully. Now, it is true that the primary theater or the principal area of competition, definitely military competition, between the United States and China has taken place in the Pacific. And it's likely to continue to take place along China's eastern seaboard. And there we have, where there the United States has allies like Japan. We see contested issues like China or the South China Sea, sorry, like Taiwan or the South China Sea. And of course, that's where the bulk of our militaries square off against one another. So I don't mean to discount the significance of the Pacific to the US-China competition. But if you look at this map on the slide, you will also begin to get a sense for China's geographic proximity to the rest of continental Eurasia. And there I consider places like South Asia. So there it's a sort of a medium gray color. It includes Afghanistan and Pakistan, India, among other countries. Or Central Asia, there you'll see further to the north of South Asia, so Kazakhstan being the major player there, but also Uzbekistan being important, and Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and so on. So in Central Asia as well, China is bordering a number of these states. And then even onward into the Middle East, when you get into up to the Mediterranean Sea. So that's why I say that China, if it were to extend its influence across this region, it would reach all the way up to Europe's doorstep. Okay, so this is important because since the 20th century, at least the 20th century, the United States has been an emerging and then a true global power. And throughout that time, it has had a series of concerns about the possibility that this sweep of territory across continental Eurasia would be controlled by a single hostile power or a group of hostile powers. So earlier in the 20th century, that of course was Germany and the threat that it posed to continental Eurasia with the rise of Hitler and Nazi Germany. And then later, of course, it was the Soviet Union, which stretched clear across much of this continent and posed this Cold War challenge to the United States. And the problem, as recognized by many American strategists across this timeline, is that a major hostile power that has access to all of the resources and the territory of continental Eurasia would be a serious challenger indeed, would be tough to beat. So the question that I raise in my book is, one of the questions is China actually attempting to consolidate its influence, its power, across continental Eurasia? And the answer, at least to date, is somewhat mixed. So I wanted to step through it, but very briefly today. This is the kind of thing that we'll have more time to discuss in this book club that I've described. And in the book, I go into some great detail about what exactly is going on here. But for today, I'll touch upon it relatively lightly. And I'll begin with the question of whether China is extending its economic footprint across this region, because that's actually the easiest question to answer. And there, the answer is simple. Yes, absolutely. China is already the preponderant economic power across Eurasia. Of course, China is a major economic power globally at this point, but in many ways it has rapidly increased its role across this region when it comes to trade, certainly, as elsewhere, but also when it comes to major investments in infrastructure and companies, power infrastructure, hydropower, and hydrocarbons. When it comes to the creation of new institutions that include many members from this region, like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank or the AIIB, or new major initiatives which have an economic component to them, like the Belt and Road Initiative, the signature foreign policy initiative of China's President Xi Jinping, is principally an effort to knit together this region and others in terms of economic interconnectivity. All of these efforts are similar in that they bring Chinese goods, money, technologies, workers, Chinese rules and standards, and ultimately Chinese economic influence and power into this region in ways that we have not seen before. So the economic story, I think, is relatively plain. The political story is what I describe as an emerging story. That is, in many ways, that where China's economic power flows, political influence flows behind. And this, I think, is a natural consequence of the fact that where you are a principal investor or buyer or even seller, you have a degree of leverage that comes along with that. And this type of leverage and this types of interactions create dependencies between states in this region, buyers and sellers with China, those who need Chinese investment, those who want China to invest, to buy its energy resources, for instance. They are increasingly dependent upon China's markets. In addition to these natural economic or political consequences of economic exchange, you also see that Beijing is experimenting across the region with a variety of political tools. Tools like media campaigns, including social media campaigns, educational exchanges, a variety of splashy diplomatic initiatives, bringing people from across the region to China for various conferences and things like this, all intended to extend China's political influence throughout the area. So this is an emerging story, which I recount in greater depth throughout my book. But then there's the story, the military story. And this, I'd say, if the political story is emerging, the military story is even one step or a half step behind that political story, and at least one or two steps behind the economic story. But here, that's principally because over recent decades, China has been fairly reluctant to extend its military footprint beyond its own borders. We have seen some significant developments. For instance, China has placed a new base in Djibouti, and that is something that a number of analysts were surprised to see, but now is seen as a real marker of China's expanded military investments and ambitions overseas. And we could see other developments that are similar to that across continental Eurasia. We have seen Chinese security forces have a presence outside of China in Tajikistan along the Afghan border. That's a minor step now, but could expand over time. We have definitely seen a major increase, a sharp increase in terms of China's defense sales of military equipment, arms across the region. We've seen a number of new joint exercises that China has gotten involved with Eurasian states, including Kazakhstan or Iran, and Pakistan certainly. And we see Chinese military and security liaison activities across the region, sharing of intelligence and other activities. So if you put it all together, you definitely have a very clear new economic story of China's involvement in the region. But you also have an emerging political story of involvement and influence, and I think a nascent story of a military power projection capability that China is building across Eurasia. Now, the book also makes another point, and this is something that I would really like to emphasize. None of China's activities are happening in a vacuum. None of the things that China is doing is it doing on its own. It's doing them in partnership, and sometimes it comes at odds with other players in the region. And the book really focuses on this core issue of how the states of Eurasia matter and how their interests, ambitions, and goals, aspirations all affect the outcomes of China's activities. So in the three main cases that I look at in the book, South Asia and Central Asia and the Middle East, in each one I focus on how different countries are responding to China in at least two different ways. Now, the first of these ways really focuses on what I call the domestic political economy. So what's happening inside of each state in terms of how leaders and other interest groups are responding to China's involvement. And it asks some fairly basic questions, but of course it gets complicated quickly. And at the core, one of the questions is who's winning and who's losing within each of these societies from China's involvement there. So for instance, I look at Kazakhstan and observe that During the last financial crisis, global financial crisis, China stepped in and bailed out a number of major Kazakhstani companies, particularly in the energy sector. And that effectively bailed out the elites who were the owners and beneficiaries, principal beneficiaries of these investments. And so they were the clear winners from a greater Chinese involvement. So that's going to have consequences internally. I also asked questions about how this winning and losing affects existing cleavages within a society, political cleavages between haves and have-nots, or among various ethnic groups. And so, for instance, in Pakistan, I see that China's involvement seems to be exacerbating some pre-existing cleavages that exist between various ethnic groups. And namely, one of the ones that I look at more closely is the conflict between the province of Balochistan and many of the Balochistan's separatist groups who see China's involvement there and its investments there, including a major new port, the port of Gwadar, as something that threatens them. And it threatens them because while certain investors will make money, they may lose their land and they may lose their control over territory that they've had for generations. So that's another piece of what's happening internally and will affect what opportunities are available to China going forward. And then finally, I look to see how these leaders internally are trying to harness China to their own purposes. So for instance, I look at Iran and see how the clerical regime there, the Ayatollahs who are in charge, are increasingly reliant upon Chinese technologies for surveillance on opposition figures and for control of the Iranian internet. These are things that play to their political advantage, but obviously harm other Iranians who are looking to implement or bring about political change or reform internally. And so you can see how the internal developments are quite important and how these countries and their leaders themselves are very much a part of this story. But the second aspect that I look at here is also what's happening between states in the region. And that too is complicated. But as China, for instance, gets more involved in Pakistan, there is no question but that India will respond to this and has responded to it negatively. So the existing hostile relations between some of these states and competitions, regional competitions, say between Iran and Saudi Arabia, will be also affected by China's involvement. And you would be kidding yourself if you didn't think that these states will see China as an important partner in some instances or adversary in other instances as they face existing conflicts and competitions with their neighbors. So all of this gets pretty complicated pretty quickly. And in some ways, that's the point. Understanding localized realities, local issues on the ground throughout a place like Eurasia is essential to understanding or anticipating how China's role there is likely to play out over time. And think about it. I mean, hasn't this very same sort of dynamic been true as the United States has been involved in countries overseas around the world? Certainly from our wars in Vietnam to Afghanistan, or even our diplomacy with European allies, they always get a say. What we attempt to do or hope to do sitting here in the United States isn't necessarily what will unfold on the ground in these other countries. So why wouldn't that be true for China as well? And it is. Now, how does all this add up for the United States? First, it's a mixed economic story. China's involvement in continental Eurasia could be good for US interests. Sometimes it is. The United States has at times hoped to bring about or just inspire a regional economic integration, roads and rails and new ports and so on across this region in ways that China is also investing in. So it's not necessarily bad. But as China gets more locked in to these societies, as individuals begin to work with China, it may find that it has a prioritized place in these economies. And while China is locked in, other competitors, including from the United States, may be locked out. And so that's a potential problem from a US perspective. Certainly on the political front, much of what China is doing looks like it will be problematic for US interests. Chinese interests and influence is, I think, contributing to greater power among authoritarian regimes, illiberal regimes across this region and in other regions. And that's not something that I think is good for the United States. And certainly on the security front, there's a question of how this extension of China's military involvement across the region could play to disadvantage the United States over time, and also how China's involvement is actually exacerbating existing regional conflicts, as I mentioned before, say between India and Pakistan, or also between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So these are problems. There are many different possibilities, and I can't predict the future in terms of how this will play out. But there is very little reason to anticipate that China's involvement will inspire the types of political or economic reforms that the United States has tended to favor. There are grave concerns that I have about how it may contribute to competition and conflict in the region. And there's the potential that this involvement of China's expanded influence will lead China to have greater military access to places that we have traditionally been quite worried about and continue to be to some extent into the Middle East and certainly into Western Europe. So it's a mixed story, but generally not a great news story for the United States. And that takes me to US policy options for response to China. And that takes me to this slide. So here we see a spectrum of US policy options for responding to China in continental Eurasia, and it is not a scientific spectrum, but more or less arrayed from less committed and competitive to more committed and competitive in terms of US involvement in the region. And it begins, I'll begin with number one, this on the less committed side, with the potential strategy or option of what I've termed a strategic withdrawal. And you might also call it benign neglect. Now, this begins with the notion that there are limits to US influence, certainly everywhere, but certainly in continental Eurasia. This is a place that's far from the United States. And increasingly, there are questions about the degree of US interests in this region as well. Mainly, when we look at the region right now, what we see are negative interests. That is, we are concerned about what's going on in this region. Issues like terrorism or nuclear proliferation or human rights abuses raise concerns back here in the United States. But these are not things that we want. These are things we're worried about. We're no longer as concerned, say, with hydrocarbon, oil, and gas resources of this region, in part because we have a surplus of them now here at home, or at least we're less concerned about these things than we once were. And this contrasts with the more positive interests that we may have in treaty allies and partners, deep economic partners like Japan or in Western Europe. So we might just say, leave this region to China. Withdraw strategically, more or less. Allow China to have its way. Why not even allow China, if it wants to try to fix this region in ways that we certainly haven't been able to? And I've heard people make exactly this point. You know, China wants to have greater influence in Pakistan, let them. This is not a particular concern to the United States. And as I puzzle through this, I would say there is one potential problem with this, which is that while China has an interest, an economic interest, an interest in resource extraction, capturing new markets, even projecting military power throughout this region, it doesn't show much proclivity or interest in solving some of the underlying economic and political problems that plague this region. To the contrary, it looks like it would be more inclined to stand aside and let these troubles persist even as it pursues its own interests. So you could get a kind of a worse of all possible worlds scenario in which China extends its influence but doesn't do much to bring about stability or economic or political reform. Now, there's a slightly more positive way to think about this strategy, and some would, I think, describe it as a strong point defense strategy. So if you think back to the Cold War, strategist George Kennan came up with the notion that we, the United States, need to pick and choose our battles very carefully. We should really place most of our efforts and resources on protecting strong points on areas of vital national security and national interest. And if most of continental Eurasia is not one of these areas, then at this point, we should, as I said before, do a strategic withdrawal or at least generally neglect the region in a benign way. So that's option one. Option two, described by me in the book as peaceful accommodation. So this is the idea that if you look at the possibility of an emerging new Cold War type of conflict with China, and you think about the costs that this could bring about, this becomes very worrisome. So former graduate school colleague and actually a SAIS graduate, Lyle Goldstein, has pointed out that the United States really would do better to attempt to find ways to accommodate its interests with those of China, to seek opportunities for compromise, to look for ways to avoid this kind of Cold War competition. And if we think about continental Eurasia, we have to admit that this type of cooperation seems more plausible than in many other places on Earth. I, for instance, have had a number of conversations with Chinese experts about the possibility of greater cooperation in South Asia to help to mitigate or even prevent future conflicts between countries like India and Pakistan. The United States and China basically sit eye to eye on these points, and why not work together more closely on them? But even in continental Eurasia, it's pretty clear, as you begin to look at this, that peaceful accommodation won't be easy. Even our aid agencies, U.S. Agency for International Development or China's counterpart, have no practice of working together, and trust between our two sides is very low. I tell a story, for instance, in the book about how a Chinese PLA officer approached me at a meeting in Pakistan and said, we're not going to share information about where our aid projects are because you will look to ruin them. We're in competition with you. Why would we share that type of information? Now, one version of peaceful accommodation, which does seem to be ongoing, has been suggested by another graduate, actually of SAIS, Gal Luft, who's pointed out that US companies often win when Chinese initiatives include infrastructure development, for instance, big power plants or other things, because US companies will be the manufacturers who provide some of the material that go into these things. So GE turbines will be used, and that will make millions, if not billions of dollars for American industry. And so there is a possibility for a true win-win here between the United States and China. And if you take this back to the broader point about peaceful accommodation, if the two sides practice this type of cooperation, even on the economic side or the commercial side, maybe they'll have greater success in doing so on the political side. Okay, that takes me to a third strategy or potential option for a strategy, which I've described as critical publicity. So rather than sitting back or ceding the ground to China, and rather than trying to find ways for peaceful accommodation, why not highlight some of the problems with what China is up to in continental Eurasia, especially when it comes to Chinese values and ideology, which is clearly at odds with that of the United States. And why not try to get other countries around this region to recognize the kind of threat that we believe China actually poses to the region? My colleague at SAIS, Hal Brands, has written about this, and he's suggested that the United States should, and I quote, do more to highlight the authoritarian, brutal aspects of Chinese rule here and in other parts of the world. Now, the United States, under the Trump administration, has actually done a fair amount of critical publicity. So I mentioned Secretary of State Pompeo's speech recently. He said, for instance, the free world must triumph over this new tyranny, meaning China. And Pompeo's speech is just the latest in a string of speeches that really date back to the beginning, early stages of this administration. We've heard similar lines from Vice President Pence, although from the president, we've heard more of a mixed message overall. Now, criticism of China of this sort has come in speeches, but there are other ways that you could engage in a strategy of critical publicity as well. You could reinvent or ramp up Cold War initiatives and institutions that we used at the time, like the US Information Agency, to kind of publicize news of what China is doing, say corruption in Chinese projects or Chinese coercive practices or human rights abuses at home, these sorts of things. These types of stories could be shared more widely across the region, raising questions in the minds of Eurasians about what China is really up to. Another alternative would be training and supporting foreign journalists and scholars and analysts to uncover and really disseminate what's going on in their own countries. Again, to unmask corruption or bribery, bad business practices, bad loans, these kinds of things. And at the same time, in the modern world, the United States could do more to build up the technical capacity of activists and journalists who are trying to do their work in increasingly authoritarian environments where it's very difficult to get the word out. To keep the internet open and easy to access for societies that are increasingly closed to this type of information, and to push back against the illiberal tendencies of China and a number of the other states in the region. Right now, the pendulum, the technological pendulum, seems to have swung in favor of the authoritarians who are seeking to limit access and to raise questions and doubts among the minds of Democrats around the world. But if we can begin technologically and otherwise to swing that pendulum back, we could open up that debate and unmask more of what's going on. Of course, lots of work needs to be done in this area. That takes me to a fourth area of potential strategy, and that I've described as selective competition. So here, where critical publicity is really a rhetorical strategy, this is putting more action behind that rhetoric. So here, for instance, where the Trump administration has criticized publicly China's investments in infrastructure in Asia and elsewhere, here you could build up the American effort to compete against China's infrastructure investments. Another example of selective competition would be the United States' active courtship of a closer relationship with India, a major Asian power which could serve as a strategic counterweight to China in Asia. And that's something that we've been at for now several presidential administrations. Now, there are no other countries quite like India in size or in many other ways as well, but you could imagine the United States trying to improve its ties with other countries in Eurasia, from Kazakhstan and elsewhere, mainly driven by the logic of competition with China. So not so much we seek a better bilateral relationship with Kazakhstan on its own terms, but because we're concerned about Kazakhstan's growing ties with China. The United States may also want to flip this around and question whether our difficult relations in the region, say with Iran or with Russia or even with Pakistan, ought to be reassessed and reimagined in the context of competition with China. Perhaps we should find better ways to work with these countries, or at least open up the door to that cooperation, because we are concerned about their growing ties with Beijing. Alternatively, you could take it in a different direction and say that as these countries grow closer to China, the United States should take an even tougher line against them. But in any case, the whole goal here is to appreciate these relations through the prism of our competition with Beijing. And that takes me to the last and most committed or competitive of the strategies on offer, that being militarized competition. So as I said before, China hasn't invested a great deal in terms of its buildup of its military forces throughout continental Eurasia, but this could change. I mentioned this new base in Djibouti. I didn't mention that China has invested in a new port, a deep sea port in Pakistan, the Gwadar port, which I talk about at length in the book. And there you have the potential that China could see that also as a new military base down the line. And the United States is going to need to decide whether and how to respond to these types of Chinese military developments. In many cases, the US response will depend on how the countries of the region see what China is doing and how they seek to respond. If they're concerned about China's activities, they may be more inclined to work closely with the United States to provide us with support, but also to work with us on training and exercises, and think on ways that we could work more closely together, even new alliance structures are conceivable under these circumstances. Now, if we step back from all of these options, we do have to say that some of them look increasingly unlikely. As the United States and China, as our relationship deteriorates, peaceful accommodation seems less likely than at least the critical publicity, which is actually ongoing. But this competition is likely to last a long time, and there are likely to be thaws in the relationship and improvements over time. And so I don't think we should close the door to any of these options entirely. And that really takes me to my last topic for today, which is the policy recommendations that I would make for the United States as we look forward. And I propose a strategy of what I would call selective and differentiated competition with China, at least in Eurasia. And so, as I just said, I think we should keep our options open. I don't think that we should see these options as choose one and stick with it, but more as a menu of options that we may apply in different cases at different times across this region. We should keep these options open in part because our competition with China and Eurasia is not as urgent or immediate as our competition is in the Asia-Pacific region. And I think it's premature also to read a future of Cold War that looks very much like the past of our Cold War with the Soviet Union. Much is not yet determined. I'm also concerned that we may be entering a period of what I would describe as mindlessly competitive efforts to beat China at its own games. And I've seen numerous examples of this, but frequently you'll read about Chinese investments in a country like Malaysia. And then others will respond, analysts will respond, that the proper US response is to outbid the Chinese in these efforts. And I would say that's precisely the wrong approach. We need to stick to what we're good at, to find our strengths, and not necessarily ape the Chinese in every action that they take. So instead, I would leave you with 5 rules that I would focus on. These would be, first, carefully select where the United States is operating and think very carefully about the local interests at play. As I say, what happens in these countries, much of it will depend on what these countries want for themselves, not what China is up to. Just because a country may be working with China, say Pakistan now working closely with China, doesn't mean that it is forever and in every way pro-Beijing. It simply means that they perceive their interests, at least in the immediate term, to be better served by China. It is less likely that they're ideologically aligned with China than simply that they seek to advance their own more narrow interests. And where there will be opportunities for the United States to advance those interests, they may wish to work more closely with us as well. So that's rule 1. Rule 2, remain open to tactical cooperation with China. That is, there are going to be areas in Eurasia where we and Beijing actually see more or less eye to eye. I would submit that nuclear war between India and Pakistan is something that served neither of our interests terribly well, and where we have a mutual interest in cooperating on looking for ways to mitigate that potential conflict. Third rule, look for lower cost means to preserve or extend US influence in this region, which again is farther from our core interests. Think about some relatively easy wins, educational exchanges in places like Kazakhstan, where open access to the types of information that we have is really not available, or helping governments in the region assess their deals with China, unpack whether they're good or bad or helpful or harmful to their national interests, or helping local activists investigate and disseminate information about bad deals and bad business practices with Chinese firms that are unfolding in their own countries. Rule 4, we should invest in our long-term capacity to compete militarily with China in continental Eurasia and think seriously about those developments. We now face a China that is a military concern to us in East Asia and the Pacific. In a decade or two, we may see a similar type of threat emerging right up, as I say, at the doorstep of Europe. We should be preparing for that possibility. It's not a necessary outcome, but it is a plausible one. And fifth, we should make the United States a better defender of liberal and democratic causes throughout this region, We should be helping, in particular, we should be working with journalists and scholars. These are natural American allies. And I don't think that they will find a friend in China, at least the current communist-led China. And to do this, we need to be a credible defender of the press and freedoms at home. If we have all of these things, I think success in this strategy would at least allow the United States to offer a strategic alternative to China and Chinese influence across Eurasia over the long run. It would probably never make the United States a dominant player in the region. It wouldn't even necessarily stem the rising influence of the Chinese, but I think we can trust that the Eurasians themselves prefer to keep their own options open, prefer to continue to have a degree of autonomy, and will see in us a useful partner in doing that. So that is my opening lecture. I see we're now 45 minutes in, and we've already started to get some questions. I would encourage you to continue to send along the questions. The first question I see is from Curtis, and he writes, with new research coming out that COVID-19 possibly started in Southeast Asia and has been there for decades, might this be able to change the rhetoric between the United States and China on the blame game for COVID-19? So I'm not really sure about the new research you're talking about, but I will say that the problem in the COVID-19 era is not just about where the disease started. It really does relate at some level to a degree of a lack of trust between China and, frankly, the rest of the world in terms of sharing information about the early outbreak and what China was doing about it. And then now has been exacerbated by a blame game that I do not think any kind of a shift in assessment about where this started will actually change. So no, I think we've entered into a political moment where the coronavirus is a piece of it, but not the sole piece, maybe an exacerbating component. I see there's a second question here from Don. It says, I recall that China has a history of recurrent border conflicts with its neighbors. How is this issue evolving? It's an interesting question. So not only does China have a history of border conflicts with a number of its neighbors, including in Southeast Asia, like with Vietnam, but of late, over the past couple of months, we've seen a remarkable and unfortunate turn of events between China and India. And we've seen this rise of conflict. We've seen the most significant loss of life along their contested border in over 4 decades. And we've seen that come about in part because both of these, at some basic level, we have 2 rising Asian powers, both of which are seeking to firm up their land borders, and neither of which accepts the other's border as the definitive line. So they have what's called a line of actual control. And both of them are putting more and more effort in terms of military defenses along this area, which is bringing their militaries closer and closer into conflict. And that's what I think we're seeing as both sides kind of jockey for tactical advantage along these lines and are more deeply concerned about the strategic implications should one side gain a tactical advantage, that it might exploit that. Not necessarily in the case of a major war, but possibly holding the other side or making the other side feel vulnerable to its demands in a crisis. And this is the kind of thing that, India and China have been at odds, certainly for decades. They had fought a war over their border in 1962. So this in some ways is not new. But what is new is that these are now 2 major and rising powers with military capabilities that could really swing this into a war that would have consequences, not just for them, but for the rest of the world. And of course, this draws the United States in because, as I said before, the United States has now seen for almost 2 decades now, has seen India as a major and important power and player and partner, strategic partner in Asia in terms of counterbalancing against China. And so as we consider our relationship with India, its greater tensions with China create complexity there and raise questions about how we should manage that as well, to what extent we should back India in these conflicts, how we can do that without making the problem potentially even worse. Okay, I see a next question from D. what do you mean when you say an illiberal regime? So in many of the countries that I've described as illiberal, and I probably should have clarified this at the outset, I would contrast that with the certain types of freedoms of the press, of speech, human rights, and opportunities for scholarship and journalism that we enjoy here at home. All of these, of course, are enshrined in our Constitution. And are protected by our ability to seek access to courts and to pursue these things politically, freedom of assembly. These are all components of a liberal regime that we have gotten used to, a democratic country that we live in here in the United States. But for much of continental Eurasia, what we see is something very different. Either strongman regimes, which have at times not terribly realistic or real elections, or kingdoms in the case of Saudi Arabia, or clerically dominated regimes in Iran. And China is itself a single party state. Communist Party dominates all politics and is comfortable working with other, what I again describe as illiberal states, where the party or the state itself gets to determine the rules for its people who don't have nearly as much say in the matter. That's the distinction that I'm trying to draw. And I'm concerned that China and Russia and other illiberal regimes, at the very least, they see no value in promoting these values, whereas we do. And I think I prefer to live under a more liberal regime, and I think that many others would as well. So I think that's an American interest that we share with many peoples across the world. We have another question from Martin. Can you talk about the differences between elite and popular views of China in regional countries and how this may affect China's ability to operate in these countries? This is at the core of, I hope, a number of the conversations that people who join this book club, virtual book club, will be able to have, because this is one of the most fascinating elements of what's going on across the region. So if you think about it, again, in kind of crude and simple terms, who are the winners and who are the losers in a country like, I don't know, Kazakhstan or Pakistan or Iran when it comes to dealing with China? Typically in these societies, not surprisingly, the winners are the ones who are already in power, who already have their fingers on the levers of power and who already enjoy a degree of control over economic and commercial institutions, and for whom Chinese investments and Chinese mega deals, some of that money will go right into their pockets. And so these are likely to be winners. And these are the elites. In many of these countries, a kind of a narrow, a slim layer of society upon which, below which sit, in some cases, hundreds of millions of people. The hundreds of millions of people, those who are the not elites, often tend to be the losers as well, or the potential losers in this. And the cleavages that emerge there are socioeconomic in the first instance, but we're also seeing, I think, some interesting cleavages on other issues, on political issues. So I mentioned Kazakhstan. There we see an interesting potential cleavage between the elites who have business deals with China and the masses who are increasingly concerned about what China is up to in Xinjiang, in its western province, and what it is doing with the Uyghur people who are Muslim, and other Muslims who live throughout China. Its repression of these groups inside China has spilled over into Kazakhstan, and sometimes actually has brought ethnic Kazakhstanis who are living, Kazakhs who are living in China, has brought them into the same, you might call re-education camps or internment camps that China has set up for Uyghurs. And they're very upset about that. And so you have a mass response which is very negative to China's involvement. And an elite level of leadership that is eager not to rock the boat too much for China for fear that their business deals will be upset by that, or that China will cause them other sorts of troubles in other ways. So there's an interesting cleavage emerging there, and we're seeing it in a number of instances across the region. It's something definitely to watch out for. So we have another question here. Let's see, from Avi. How do the maritime actions and military exercises of the members of the Quad, in quotes, and other alliance geometries, US, India, Japan, US, India, Philippines, play into Chinese maritime ambitions? So this is a great question. This actually isn't something that I get into much in the book, although I do touch upon it a bit. And what you're describing, Avi, is this idea that the United States has had of trying to build up a variety of different groupings, including this Quad. So think about it, US, India, Japan, and in the Quad, Australia. How are these countries, might they come together and create a kind of a common front or a unified group against Chinese aggression, potentially in the Asia Pacific? Now, in many ways, the initiatives are more strategic and potentially influential than they are actualized. In other words, these are not, in the case of the Quad, this is not a true alliance in any sense. And at this moment, this is really only amounted to a series of military dialogues, sometimes somewhat more senior, but generally at a middle level, and a desire to coordinate efforts and to share more information. But one could imagine these evolving into something more significant. And of course, that's the direction that a number of folks, certainly within the Trump administration and prior administrations, have sought to go, and where you'll get a lot of positive response often from Japan, which has been a traditional maritime adversary of China, but where India has been somewhat more reluctant up until recently to involve itself too deeply, and where Australia has come and gone. I would imagine, though, that these will evolve, and perhaps rapidly, as the competition with China heats up. China's reaction generally, though, to answer your question, has been quite negative, and has been looking for ways to shut these things down, or at least to make sure that they can try to drive wedges between them. They are concerned about alliance structures evolving to counter China in its neighborhood. All right, we've got a few more minutes, so let me take one more at least from Tapas. Do you think China might extend its land acquisition beyond Tibet to countries like Nepal? The short answer would be no. I don't anticipate China attempting major territorial conquest, whether it's in Nepal or in other parts of the region, into Central Asia. There have been concerns among Central Asian states that the Chinese may seek to revise territorial boundaries that were basically determined in the period after the Cold War. They are worried about this, and there are reasons to be worried because China is now evolving to be a major military power, and these countries generally are much weaker on the military front, so wouldn't be able to put up much of a fight. But as I point out in the book, and a broader argument I would make, China doesn't really need to saddle itself with territorial aggression of this sort. It's exceedingly costly, deeply unpopular, can take decades and decades, as is found in Tibet, to deal with these problems. And the resulting frustrations among local populations. And China's aims at this point in history, I think, are less territorial conquest and more to have political and economic influence and potentially be able to project its military power through these countries by rail or by air, to have a virtual, in a sense, growing empire, or at least area, a sphere of influence, without having to do so, taking things over. So I would say no territorial conquest, but yes, increasing involvement. Okay, last question from Jane. How would this tension impact the life of Chinese in the US now? Do you see this tension driving more Chinese elites back to China? Will that adversely affect the US? I'll keep my answer to this one short. Yes, I do think that what is evolving now in that sense looks in negative ways more like this Cold War, that the tensions between China and the United States are boiling over into the popular realm, which will make the United States both less welcoming to Chinese citizens and less appealing to Chinese who are considering the United States as a place to work or study or simply come to live. I think that's unfortunate because I think that the United States benefits from immigrants from all over the world. But I do think, as we're seeing in these stories, these unfolding stories, say from the consulate in Houston, there are also some concerns the US government has about certain Chinese, a very small number, I think, in the scheme of things, doing things that fall in the category of spy work. And that's problematic. What we wouldn't want to see is this entering into the something like the Red Scare of the old Cold War era, where the United States and people in the United States become suspicious of Chinese and Chinese Americans. That would be obviously detrimental to US interests and is precisely the kind of thing that we need to avoid. So let me wrap up here. And again, I want to thank all of you for joining us here at Hopkins at Home. I would also like to remind you to come back to the website for more programming and also for information about this virtual book club. I hope many of you will take advantage of that opportunity. And until then, please stay safe and healthy.